Quick note before we start this week's episode. I hadn't even considered it's Father's Day today. One Page Weekly with Nick Slavik, my dad and the Chimney. Data plus feelings. It's time to tell the story of my father and the Chimney. 30% of businesses do not survive the second generation. The reasons? Unexpected death with no succession plan. The second generation is not prepared or capable enough to run the business. And of course, family dynamics, money, control, and the unresolved relationship stuff. I think about this chimney often. I drove by the neighborhood where it happened 2 days ago, so it popped into my head again. I now know that this was one of the foundational moments in my story and how my business is run, but I didn't know it then. And if I'm being really honest, I've completely changed how I felt about it over the past 25 years. I was on leave from the Army, having recently finished airborne school. I trained in Georgia in the heat of summer. That alone was near torture. This training prepared me to jump from airplanes and do Army stuff when I hit the ground. The final test of that school was 5 jumps, one being at night. The story of that last jump is another one-page weekly altogether, and another foundational moment in my story. I was in peak physical shape, since running is one of the main activities jump masters like to occupy your time with in airborne school. As I was apt to do, I painted with my father while I was on leave. He left one part of an exterior job to do, and in hindsight, it's obvious to me now why he saved this for when I was home. It was a 1.5-story home in the front and a 2.5-story home in the back, a walk-up, as we call it in the Midwest. When my father would have a bit left to do on a home, it was never the front door. It was always something gnarly, the sketchiest stuff. On the back side of this home stood a chimney. It was the type that ran up the side as a bump out from the ground past the roof line, 7 feet or so, a 3-sided structure the entire way. I put our 32-foot ladder all the way up. It just touched its bumpers onto the aluminum gutter next to the chimney. There remained 7 feet of chimney above the ladder, but typically reachable from standing on the roof, from my past experiences. There are things about my job I do not have to describe in detail for you to understand. The before and after images of historic restorations are deeply satisfying, and we all know how much work goes into them. And a happy client, one where they had a real need and I solved it. Seriously, nothing better. We can all understand those things and how they feel. But I'll take a minute to describe climbing onto a roof from an extension ladder, because not many people have had the pleasure of doing it. Certainly not 3 stories into the air. And we're not talking a 16-foot ladder on a 1-story rambler, where 4 foot of the ladder extends above the roof for safe and easy hand placement. I was at the top of this 32-foot ladder, 3 stories into the air. There was no more ladder above the roof line. There was no fall resting harnesses, no roof cleats, no chicken ladder. Not a single shred of safety device or planning. I'd be lying to you if I told you that any of these things ever existed in my father's business. It's not like this job was an outlier, but none of this stuff existed in any father-son trades business in those days either. I stood at the top of the ladder, my father on the ground, my 3-inch brush, scraper, and bucket of stain in hand. I'd do what I always did. Pushed up, made an attempt to grab the side of the chimney for support, and heave myself onto the roof. It was a long stretch. 1 foot on the ladder, long stretch up and out, still reaching, and just barely touched the corner of the chimney. I could have done one big heave and onto the roof, but I was dubious about the reverse maneuver after the chimney was done. I collected myself for a bit, tried 3 more times with different techniques. It didn't feel right. It really did not feel right. This would be the first time I ever couldn't just do it. And I told my father that. Fine then, I'll do it, he said quietly when we were at the bottom of the ladder together. I watched my father slowly climb the ladder and work himself onto the roof. Watching this was not satisfying or informative. It was tense. and I saw a man put far too much risk into something that did not matter or could have been done differently. I held the ladder. The chimney was painted by my father. Agonizing mental torture I was experiencing at the bottom of that ladder. I was too young to put a name on that torture. I remember two things vividly from that day. A deep feeling of shame, letting my father down, and what he said to me. And what he said to me in the truck when we drove home. I know what happened back there. That was the only thing that was said in the truck that day. What did happen back there? In that truck on that day after the chimney, in my head, what had happened was I was weak. I failed him. I didn't have it in me to do what he did. I was a big, strong soldier, and my father was still better than me. I felt shame and humiliation. I'd be interested to know what my father thought that day, or even if he remembers it at all. 1 marriage, 4 kids, 2 wars, and 3 businesses later, I think about this day differently than I did back then. The chimney was a lot like my younger life. It was a choice of do it or don't. Heave onto the roof or don't. But I know now that there are 6 other ways to more safely and more efficiently do that chimney. I've implemented all of them in my company for my own people. I hadn't considered that the board that we were playing the game on could just be different. What I felt was a failure back then was actually one of the cornerstones of my professional life. My gut was telling me that it was a bad idea, but the rules of the game were binary. I didn't like the options, but didn't have enough life experience to question my father or the options. I do now. And a few years after the chimney, I would leave my own family business because of an accumulation of things like this. The game didn't give me enough options. I didn't like the board, and in fact, I hate board games. So I went and did something else, which I hadn't considered as an option in my younger years. This is how it was back then. Allegiance to my father and an overwhelming urge to find my own self-worth in the approval of others led me to do some dangerous things. But the chimney was the turning point. This is the first time I followed my own instinct and made a decision that felt like the right thing to do, even in the face of what felt like a momentarily bad decision and the shame and guilt that came with it, and knowingly putting my father at risk. You could not imagine the conflict within me. It's in such sharp contrast to the clarity within me now. I've not really told this story before, not because of its weight, but because it's only one of hundreds like it. It feels insignificant compared to the sheer numbers of experience I've had like this, but it's beginning to stand out much more, especially as I get older and see my kids approaching the age I was when I stood atop of that ladder and worked up everything I could to heave myself onto that roof. This has been One Page Weekly with Nick Slavik.